Most of what we call health today has nothing to do with being well. It's about control. It's about productivity. It's about obedience dressed up as optimization. Your body isn't being cared for. It's being managed, tracked, measured, corrected, disciplined. And if you've ever felt like your worth rises and falls with your consistency, your leanness, your output, or your discipline, that didn't come from nowhere. That came from a system that treats the human body like a project instead of a place you live. And once that system gets inside you, it doesn't just shape how you eat or train. It shapes how you rest, how you relate to discomfort, how you measure your value, how you decide whether you're doing enough. In the last episode, I talked about the postmodern self, how identity is fractured, how meaning isn't handed to us anymore, and why so many people feel scattered, overwhelmed, and internally conflicted. This episode picks up where that left off, because once the big stories about who you are collapse, something else rushes in to take their place. And for most of us, that something is optimization. The body becomes a site of control. Health becomes a moral performance. Discipline becomes proof that you're worthy. And rest starts to feel like failure. Today, we're talking about the neoliberal body, how a system obsessed with productivity, efficiency, and self-management turned wellness into another form of labor. And if you haven't listened to the first episode yet, I'd go back and start there. Not because this one won't make sense, but because together they tell the full story of how we ended up here. Because until you understand the system shaping your relationship with your body, you'll keep thinking this is a personal problem. It's not. And for those of you watching on YouTube or on your podcast streaming, yes, that is a giant cut on my forehead. As you might know, I coach jiu-jitsu for mixed martial artists, and they are younger, stronger, faster, and much more capable than me. So I often come out with some dings and dents. That is not a surprise. Also, you might notice a little bit of chaos in my background. Sarah and I switched offices, so I am kind of in a transition period, which is very fitting for this podcast. So you will see that normally my background is very curated to look very neat. This is the more appropriate view of what my office actually looks like day to day. All right, so now that I got those little show notes out of the way, let's get back to it. So postmodernism can take things apart. The problem is it can't tell you how to live. It can't name the fragmentation, explain the collapse of meaning, validate why identity feels unstable. But it leaves you standing in the rubble asking, okay, now what? That's where this episode begins, because awareness without orientation becomes paralysis, and deconstruction without leadership turns into drift. Today isn't about tearing anything else down. It's about building something sturdy enough to stand inside a world that refuses to simplify itself. This is where we move from philosophy to practice, from critique to construction, from naming the problem to learning how to lead yourself inside it. If part one explained why you feel the way you do, this episode is about how to live from here forward, with clarity, coherence, and a center that doesn't disappear every time the world shifts. Welcome to Food on the Mind, Awaken Genius, where we break free from food obsession, unlock our potential, and build a life worth living. I'm Jeb Stuart Johnston, and here we dig into the psychology, philosophy, and strategy behind lasting change, because transformation isn't just about what's on your plate, it's what's on your mind. If you're here, thank you. And if you find this episode valuable, hit subscribe, leave a review, or tap like if you're watching this on YouTube. It helps more than you know. Now, let's dive into part two. So let's talk about my philosophy, a postmodern response. So if postmodernism leaves us standing in the rubble of old stories, then the question becomes simple. How do we live now? How do we build a self in a world without a single script? How do we create meaning when meaning isn't handed to us anymore? And this is really where my philosophy begins. Not as a rejection of postmodernism, but as an evolution of it. Postmodernism shows us the cracks. It revealed the plurality inside us. It exposed the instability of truth and the weight of context. It made us honest about the world we actually live in. But the human mind can't survive on deconstruction alone. We need direction. We need orientation. We need something to stand on. Not because truth is simple, but because life demands action. So here's the answer I've come to after years of coaching, recovery, relapse, rebuilding, falling apart, getting back up, and watching people search for themselves in the middle of all this cultural noise. You don't need one story. You need a center. Not a rigid identity, not a grand narrative, not a single truth hammered into place, but a core you can return to when the world around you fractures. That center is self-leadership. The version of you that isn't one of the parts, the version of you that isn't fighting for control, the version of you that can hold the different voices inside you without becoming any of them. A steady hand in the middle of a plural system. Because you're not required to fix the fragmentation. You're required to lead it. When you do that, when you step into that internal center, everything shifts. The part of you that wants comfort and the part that wants growth can finally coexist. The part that's scared and the part that's ambitious can have a conversation instead of a war. The part that avoids and the part that longs for a momentum can finally be heard without sabotaging the whole system. This isn't about control. This is about relationship. A relationship with the many parts of yourself grounded in something deeper than any one of them. And that brings me to the second piece of this philosophy. Your body is not separate from your meaning making. Your biology isn't optional. Your nervous system is part of the truth. Postmodernism told us truth is contextual, and that's right. But context isn't just cultural or linguistic. It's physiological. Your capacity is a truth. Your regulation is a truth. Your overwhelm is a truth. Your safety is a truth. You can't think your way into coherence. You have to feel your way into it by learning how to read the signals of your own system. That's nervous system intelligence. Not as a buzzword, not as a trend, but as a way of orienting yourself in a world where certainty isn't guaranteed. And then there's the third pillar, strategy. Not as rigidity, not as control, but as scaffolding. Because awareness without structure is chaos. Reflection without action is stagnation. Insight without direction dissolves into confusion. You don't need a rigid plan. You need a flexible structure, something you can adapt as you change, something that helps you move forward even when the path isn't clear, something that doesn't demand perfection but invites leadership. When you bring these three things together, a steady inner center, a regulated nervous system, and a strategic container for action, you get something postmodernism never offered. A way to live, a way to choose, a way to lead yourself inside complexity. Not by pretending the world is simpler than it is, and not by surrendering to the chaos of 1,000 truths, but by building a core strong enough to carry the weight of your own multiplicity. Postmodernism opened the door, but you still have to walk through it. And when you do, you stop searching for a single story to save you and start becoming the one who leads the many stories inside you. Postmodernism gave us language for the world we actually live in. The complexity, the fragmentation, the collapse of singular narratives. It helped us understand why old systems don't fit anymore, why we feel peeled apart, why identity isn't a clean single-thread experience. But here's where I part ways with it. Because at some point, you have to stop analyzing the cracks and start living your life. And there are places where postmodernism simply doesn't serve the human experience, places where it becomes more obstacle than insight. Let me walk you through one of the biggest ones. I don't buy the idea that your truth excuses your outcomes. One of the most seductive misunderstandings of postmodern thinking is this idea that if truth is subjective, then anything goes. That you can bend reality to your story, that consequences are negotiable, that your interpretation is all that matters. But interpretation doesn't override physics or biology or behavior. You can tell yourself a story about why you overeat. You can tell yourself a story about why you avoid hard conversations. You can tell yourself a story about why you can't change. But your nervous system still responds. Your body still keeps score. Your relationships still feel the impact. Your life still moves, or doesn't, based on what you do, not just what you believe. Subjective truth can explain your behavior. It cannot protect you from the consequences of that behavior. And any philosophy that pretends otherwise is leaving you unprepared for your own life. Fragmentation is real, but fragmentation is not destiny. Postmodernism is right. You're made of parts, many selves, many desires, many histories, many voices. But it's there. As if pluralism is the final revelation. It is not. Multiplicity without leadership becomes chaos. Multiplicity with leadership becomes power. The goal isn't to fuse your parts into one thing. It's to cultivate an inner center capable of holding all of them. A leader, not a dictator. A conductor, not a suppressor. A witness, not a referee. Postmodernism names the plurality, but it gives you no way to organize it. You need a philosophy that doesn't just describe your fragmentation. You need one that teaches you how to live inside it. Number 3, not all narratives are equal, and pretending they are keeps people stuck. If every story carries the same weight, then no story has any weight at all. And the truth is, some stories liberate you and some stories bury you. I always quit on myself. No one really loves me. This is just who I am. I can't trust myself. I'll never change. I need chaos to feel alive. These narratives are familiar. They're comforting in a twisted way, but they are not neutral. They are not just your truth. They are choices, unconscious ones, but choices nonetheless, and they shape the direction of your entire life. A philosophy that refuses to evaluate narratives leaves people trapped in the very stories that harm them. You don't need the freedom to believe anything. You need the courage to believe something better. For pure deconstruction leaves people spiritually homeless. This is the quiet danger of postmodernism. We need coherence, direction, rhythm, grounding, connection, a sense of inner continuity. Even if those things are not absolute, even if they're built rather than inherited, even if they evolve. People don't need a perfect truth, they need a working truth, something they can move towards, something that stabilizes the system, something that helps them act, choose, and commit in a world where nothing is guaranteed. A life can't be built on critique. At some point, it has to be built on intention. And so this is where my work draws a line. We don't need one truth, but you need a truth you can live. You don't need one identity, but you need an internal center strong enough to guide the many you carry. You don't need certainty, but you need direction. You don't need perfection, but you need leadership. You don't need a return to the old world, but you need more than the chaos of this one. And that's what this philosophy is for. To help you navigate a world without one story by becoming the one who leads the many stories inside yourself. Because postmodernism can describe the terrain, but only you can decide how to walk with it. So everything we've talked about so far, the fragmentation, the complexity, the loss of a single narrative, the plurality inside you, it isn't abstract, it's not theory, it's not academic. It shows up in the most intimate parts of your life, in the ways you try to change, in the ways you fall apart. Because here's the truth most self-help never acknowledges. People don't struggle because they lack discipline. People struggle because they lack coherence. Most of the suffering you feel in your day-to-day life isn't coming from laziness or weakness or a lack of willpower. It comes from the tension between the parts of you that want different things at the same time. And in a postmodern world, that tension is amplified. Let me show you what I mean. When you feel pulled in 10 directions, that's plural self in action. You want to eat better, and you want comfort. You want to work out, and you want rest. You want to show up fully, and you want to disappear. You want certainty, and you want freedom. Nothing is wrong with you. This is what it feels like to be a human being in a world without one dominant story telling you exactly who to be. The problem isn't the conflict. The problem is thinking the conflict means you're failing. When you can't stick to a plan, that's not inconsistency, it's misalignment. Most plans you're handed, fitness plans, nutrition plans, productivity plans, were designed for a version of the self that no longer exists. A single, unified, obedient self. A self without competing desires. A self that never gets overwhelmed. A self that behaves the same every day. A self that has infinite emotional bandwidth. That self is gone. It was never real to begin with. And when a plan doesn't meet your psychological reality, your body doesn't comply. It rebels. You don't fall off. You hit the limits of your capacity. You don't lack discipline. You lack integration. And no amount of motivational language will override an incoherent internal system. When you binge, overspend, shut down, avoid, or distract, that's not moral failure. It's nervous system logic. In a fragmented world, your nervous system becomes the last remaining compass you have, even if you don't know how to read it. When you're overwhelmed, your system goes into survival mode. When you're overloaded, it reaches for regulation. When you're emotionally flooded, it grabs the fastest exit. Food becomes a tranquilizer. Shopping becomes a fantasy. Work becomes anesthesia. Scrolling becomes dissociation. Conflict becomes collapse. These behaviors aren't random. They're not proof that you're broken. They're signals from a body trying to find stability in a world that offers very little of it. And when you teach these behaviors as moral problems instead of biopsychological ones, the shame becomes heavier than the habit itself. When you feel lost, it's not because you don't know your purpose. It's because the world no longer hands purpose out. There used to be one story. This is who you are. This is what matters. This is how you live. This is the path. Now, there are 1,000 paths. And you're expected to choose with perfect clarity. That pressure becomes paralyzing. When people say, I feel stuck, what they mean is, I don't know which part of me to listen to, and I'm terrified of choosing wrong. That's not a motivational issue. This is the psychological cost of a world without unified meaning. You're not weak. You're navigating complexity you were never trained to hold. When you collapse into perfectionism, that's your attempt at finding a single narrative again. This is the part almost no one sees clearly. Perfectionism is not about high standards. Perfectionism is a hunger for certainty, for one right way, for one identity that feels solid enough to silence the internal noise. When the world feels unstable, perfectionism becomes a substitute for safety. But it backfires every time. Because perfectionism demands a version of you that doesn't exist. Consistent, unchanging, untriggered, unfractured, superhuman. Your nervous system collapses under that weight. And the moment you break the rules, your entire identity falls apart. Not because you're dramatic, but because the system you were given cannot hold the reality of who you are. When you feel like you're sabotaging yourself, you're not. You're negotiating with yourself. Self-sabotage is not destruction. It's self-protection wearing the wrong outfit. It's the part of you that's scared, the part that's grieving, the part that's overwhelmed, the part that doesn't trust stability because it's never experienced it. The part that's trying to save you from an internal or external threat, even if the method makes no sense today. Postmodern fragmentation doesn't create self-sabotage. It reveals the parts inside you that were always fighting for control. The goal isn't to eliminate those parts. It's to lead them. Real personal development isn't about protecting the self. It's about organizing the self. It's not about rejecting your contradictions. It's about learning how to hold them. It's not about forcing discipline. It's about creating internal coherence. It's not about finding one true identity. It's about becoming the one who can meet every identity you contain. It's not about ending conflict. It's about leading it. This is what transformation looks like in a postmodern world. Not the elimination of complexity, but the ability to navigate it with intention. That's the real work. That's the real power. That's the kind of development that actually lasts. And it's the opposite of what most of the wellness industry teaches. Which brings us here. If everything we've talked about today points to one truth, it's this. You're not meant to go backward. You're not meant to shrink yourself to fit an older version of the world. And you're not meant to drift through the chaos of this one without an anchor. You're meant to build a relationship with your own complexity. You're meant to become the one who can hold the noise inside you without being swallowed by it. You're meant to develop a strong center, strong enough to stay standing even when the ground won't stop shifting, because the world isn't going to give you one story anymore. And maybe that isn't a loss. Maybe that's a strange kind of freedom. The freedom to choose what you stand on, the freedom to choose what you move toward, the freedom to choose the meaning you're willing to carry, the freedom to lead yourself when no single narrative can do it for you. Not a grand philosophy, not a rigid identity, not a perfect truth. Just something honest enough to shape the life in front of you. You don't need certainty. You need integrity. You need intention. You need the courage to listen to the parts of yourself you've been avoiding, and the steadiness to not get lost in them. That's the invitation. Not to erase who you've been, and not to invent some new shiny version of yourself, but to meet the self you already are, the many selves you contain, and become the one who can lead them. Because the world won't simplify. The narratives won't merge back into one. The noise won't quiet itself. But you can learn to move through it with clarity and strength and depth, and a kind of grounded presence that isn't shaken by every shift in the culture around you. You're not here to find the one right story. You're here to craft a life you can inhabit with your whole self. That's the work. And it's available to you right now. If you take nothing else from this episode, take this. You're not supposed to have all of this figured out. No one handed you a map for a world this complex. No one taught you how to lead a self made of many selves. No one trained you to hold uncertainty without collapsing into fear or fantasy. But you can learn. You can build a center that doesn't depend on the world behaving itself. You can develop an internal steadiness that doesn't vanish every time your life shifts. You can create a relationship with your own contradictions that doesn't dissolve into chaos or shame. The world isn't getting simpler, but you can get stronger, clearer, more honest, more grounded, more yourself. And that's the real work. Not perfection, not certainty, not alignment with some ideology, just becoming the one who can lead your own life with intention. That's the invitation. And if you choose it, everything changes. Not because the world gets easier, but because you get deeper. The awakening isn't a single moment, it's a lifelong practice. Awaken yourself, awaken your genius, awaken your power. Walk with this path with intention, and I'll meet you along the way. Thanks so much for listening.